Next up is the cerebrum. Your cerebrum is that upper portion of the brain. Whenever you think of one and you see those pink ridges and valleys, you're thinking of the cerebrum. Now, your cerebrum is divided up into two hemispheres, the cerebral hemisphere on the left and the cerebral hemisphere on the right. They are divided down the middle by the longitudinal fissure. This is a very deep cleft that separates the two. On the outside of the brain, you're going to see that there are ridges and valleys. Ridges and valleys. Now, the ridges are called the gyri, and the valleys are called the sulci. You can think of that as a sulci, like you're sulking, you feel low. That's going to be sulci. The gyri are the ridges. So just keep those two separate. All over the brain, you are going to see these ridges and valleys creating a wrinkled or folded appearance. And this just increases the surface area. Now, inside of the brain, we're going to see two different colors of matter. There is going to be gray matter and white matter. The big difference here is our white matter has myelination. It produces that white color due to the high amount of lipids. And the gray matter is mostly the neurons, the cell bodies, and the dendrites. On a brain, you're going to see the gray matter filling up that outer inch or so. And then the inner portion of the hemispheres is mostly the white matter, as that's going to be where your axons are located as they travel down the spinal cord, for example. So most of that gray is concentrated out in these outer gyri and sulci. Next up, we're going to do a side view of the brain. So the front of our brain will be over here. Now this front of our brain is called the frontal lobe. So eyes would be forward in this case. Just draw some little eyeballs in, some eyelashes. All right, so eyes forward. So this is the frontal direct. Now our frontal lobe is going to have covering it the gyri, the sulci, so all of our wrinkles. And we're going to see wrinkles all over these lobes. There is an area about the middle where we're going to see some special sulci that are actually named. So here, behind the frontal lobe, we're going to come up and we're going to create a sulcus called the central sulcus. Now it's called this because of its location, and it's also one of the largest ones that we're going to see. The majority of the sulcus are small. They don't go very far, maybe a couple inches. But this one creates a deep groove between this frontal lobe and the lobe behind it. Now, on your models, you're going to notice that there is a red band in front of the central sulcus. Add a little more red. That is called the precentral gyrus. In other words, the ridge in front of the central sulcus. Immediately behind it, we're going to see the post-central sense. We're going to put that one right here. So remember, these are the gyrus, the ridges, in front of and behind the central sulcus. We're going to now move on to the lobe that is behind the frontal lobe. This is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is where we're going to have our sensory for pressure or pain. Now the parietal lobe doesn't have any named sulcus or gyrus around it, and below it, we're going to have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe actually kind of comes up underneath the edge, poking forward. You can think of it in the location of your ear. And it's going to wrap around and kind of tuck up to that parietal lobe. And of course, draw in those gyrus, the ridges, and the sulcus, the valleys. On the very back of the brain, we're going to see the occipital lobe. So it's going to come along here, just kind of tuck up, forming the back of the cerebrum. Now, this area, which happens to be the farthest from the eyes, is actually where we're going to have vision control and interpretation. So there are optic nerves that come from the back of the eye all the way into the center of the brain to the thalamus, back out to the occipital. Now we are going to be doing a mid-sagittal view of the brain. So if you were to take our entire brain, cut it in half on the mid-sagittal line, meaning like straight in the middle where your nose is, for example, then we could divide the brain to half and we would see right here on the middle. First, get a little color. Try to have a little kind of peachy color. All right, so we're gonna do the shape of the brain. All right, that's a pretty good start. Now, when you look at your models, one of the first things you're going to notice is the center of the brain, this area here, is going to be the diencephalon. Before we go there, though, we're going to start with this ridge right here. There's a ridge called the corpus callosum. Now, this corpus callosum is normally drawn in a white color because we are seeing the myelinated axons. Now, the corpus callosum is a highway. And if we switch over to this one, we can actually see right here where it's located. The corpus callosum is full of axons that allow communication between the hemispheres. So you'll take input from the outer cortex, take it down through the highway of the corpus callosum and to the other hemisphere. We can also take information from the right and take it to the left. So this highway just allows communication between the two. Now on our model, when we see half of the brain, this is where the corpus callosum is located. And you can see that on any of our models. Now, because we have gone down the longitudinal fissure, this is actually surface for that outer cortex. And so we're going to see the same gyrus and sulci that we saw on the outer part of the cerebrum. So we'll draw some of those in. So we see the ridges called gyrus and the sulcus, or the valleys. Now a special one that we have to know comes right off the top of that corpus callosum and travels all the way down. So this is called the cingulate gyrus. It's just over the top of the corpus callosum on our models, but it's colored the same as the rest of the cerebrum. So the first thing we're going to do is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is going to be at the very center of the brain, it's really interesting because it actually takes up quite a bit of space. The diencephalon includes a lobe of the thalamus on this side and a lobe of the thalamus on the other. Now, when we cut the brain right down the middle to get this view, we don't see the thalamuses. These lobes are actually just present further back into the brain. So we see a little connection between the two, a little bridge, and that's all we're actually going to see of the thalamus in this case. The hypothalamus will take up a space about right there. So on your model, we're going to be able to notice a little dip right there. Now, this area is one of the ventricles. If you recall that from lab and lecture, your ventricles are where cerebrospinal fluid is stored and also produced. So we'll draw some red since, a choroid plexus would probably be in there somewhere. So this ventricle, actually let's add some blue now that I think about it. There we go. So this ventricle will be filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and just like the thalamus, this is not the whole ventricle. The whole ventricle would actually take up large amounts of space on both sides. So once again, we're kind of not seeing the entire picture. You would see more if you were able to see it from that view. But this is called our lateral ventricle. Now we make it into the diencephalon. The diencephalon, the big things that we have to know are that the thalamus is located about here, remember, inside of that lobe. Then we have an area almost like the beak of a duck is what I always thought it kind of looked like to me. Okay, so working on this region, the diencephalon, our first landmark is going to be this little dot. It's located right there. Now, this dot is actually the bridge between the thalamus, the two lobes. So we can kind of see, but behind it, you would have one lobe back there. So this area, we're just going to use that as the thalamus on our practical. The area right below it is where the hypothalamus is located. So there in orange would be our hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is where we're going to have hormones being created, and they're also stored down here in what is called the pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland is about the size of a pea, and it hangs below the diencephalon. And on our model, you're going to see a white line or a stalk for this pituitary gland. It's just called the infundibulum. A feature that you'll see towards the front is going to be this area right here. And if you were to take the brain and turn it like this and look at it, what this actually is the crossing of the optic nerve. It's going to form an X from our left hemisphere to our right eyeball, from our right hemisphere to our left eyeball. So this optic chiasm is intersected right here on this model, and it's seen right there. We have another ventricle here. Now this ventricle is not the lateral ventricle seen there. Instead, it fills up this whole space where we see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this whole region right here is called the third ventricle. Now you might be wondering, how do I tell which is which on the practical? The answer to that is if I point here and say identify the ventricle, I'm asking for the third ventricle. If I point here and say identify the structure, we're looking for the thalamus. Here, we're looking for the hypothalamus. And remember, the lateral ventricles are up here. Let's head towards the back now. The first thing we're going to see is that underneath the corpus callosum, there's a little gland right here called the pineal gland. Now it actually shows up as white on our lab models, but we'll just add a little more color to make it stand out. That is our pineal gland. This is going to help you actually going to sleep. We're going to see melatonin being produced up there. Coming off the back, we're going to see that the brain stem comes down just like this, but there's a little channel that happens. Now this little channel right through here is called the cerebral aqueduct. It's a kind of interesting name, but it basically just allows for the transfer of this cerebral spinal fluid in the third ventricle to travel back down the brainstem. We'll see where it's going here in a second. Now, one of the last few things that we have to do to finish up the brain is going to be the brainstem. Now, the brainstem comes down from the diencephalon area up here, and it's divided up into three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now, these guys, they're handling those visceral functions, the ones that you're not really consciously aware of. Your midbrain, we're going to go ahead and let's do some green on that one. It's located up here at the top. So just under the thalamus and the third ventricle, we have the midbrain. On the front side, we have the pons. And below both of them, we have the medulla oblongata. Now just below the medulla oblongata, it begins to narrow, and then we have the official start of the spinal cord as it continues down. Now, some features that we see in the brainstem are the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Now, these are small bumps on the back of the brainstem, and it's here we're going to have our visual and our auditory reflexes. So any response that you make to someone calling your name, that's going to be those superior and inferior colliculus. Now you might notice that something is missing on the back of the brain. The thing we're going to look at next is the cerebellum. Do it kind of big. Now the cerebellum is basically the butt of the brain, I like to call it, just because look at where it's placed. With the cerebellum, you're going to see two structures, the vermis and the arbor vitae. So the entire structure is the cerebellum. And whenever you see it on the lab model, you're going to see what almost looks like a tree. All these little white lines. Now, the white lines are myelinated axons traveling down into the cerebellum. Because they're myelinated, they show up as white. So all of those white lines that we see inside of it are called the arbor vitae. Now, the vermis we cannot see from this angle. We have to go back to this view. Now, here, if this is the back of the brain, there's one half of the cerebellum, and there's the other half, and there's a narrow part that connects the two. Now this connection, this narrow area, is called the vermis. So you're going to have to turn the brain and look at it from this angle to see the vermis, or the narrow connection between the two cerebellum sides. Lastly, we have one more ventricle. Do you remember the cerebral aqueduct? This passageway right here for our cerebrospinal fluid? Well, the cerebrospinal fluid flowed down the cerebral aqueduct and went into this area right here called the fourth ventricle. So that's located directly in front of the cerebellum. That's our fourth ventricle. It's the last one. And that's it for the brain. Next up will be the spinal cord.